Welcome to another podcast from the Politics Shed. In this one, I'll be exploring the Human Rights Act, which is part of those constitutional changes which Labour introduced in 1997. It included devolution, which I talked about in the previous podcast, and House of Lords reform, and the Freedom of Information Act, and possible electoral reform. So, the Human Rights Act. Well, a good start for understanding the Human Rights Act might be to ask ourselves this question, that in the news this week, Malcolm Rifkind, the former Foreign Secretary under the Conservative Party, Conservative government of the 1990s, David Blunkett, the former Home Secretary, and Jack Straw, former Home Secretary under Labour at the end of the last century, in the early years of the Labour government, and Nigel Farage, the leader of the Reform Party, what do they have in common? Well, the answer to my question, since I've asked it of myself, is they would appear to be not much. But what they have in common is that they all have, in one way or another, called for either the partial suspension of the Human Rights Act, partial withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights, or the complete withdrawal from both in Nigel Farage's case.
But here's what we have to do to make Operation Restoring Justice actually work. We have to leave the ECHR. No ifs, no buts. It may have been a good idea 80 years ago. Frankly, it isn't today. We have to repeal the Human Rights Act of 1998.
Well, how is it possible that as we sit here in 2025, that the Human Rights Act has become such a problem, or is at least being criticised significantly by figures such as Jack Straw, who actually set about introducing it. He was the Home Secretary when it was introduced. Hopefully, to answer the question as to why, if devolution has become established part of our Constitution, why the Human Rights Act has remained controversial, contested, challenged. Well, to answer that, to why that is, hopefully I will do so in the next few minutes. In the first part of this podcast, I'd like to take a rather long view. And the long view goes something like this. We're going to ask why it is, I'm going to ask, or try to answer, why it is that the idea of human rights, the idea of natural rights, rights of man, as it were, rights of men and women, is an idea which is itself somewhat problematic. It's a very old idea. So the first thing I'd like to look at is where it comes from and what exactly it is. If I believe that there are, by virtue of being human, rights that we all possess, what am I exactly saying? Where are these rights to be found? And they can only be found in one or two places, it seems to me. They can either be found external to our human experience, i.e. in the world of nature, which is something Thomas Jefferson might have appealed to, or they come from God, an omnipotent God, whose interests and whose motivations are good and wishes us to behave well, or they might come from human beings themselves, as it were, willed into existence by our minds and our rational thought, or simply shared by all humans as a sort of common sense understanding of how we should all treat each other. Well, the problem of where universal values might come from is a very old one. We could go all the way back to Plato and his world of forms. Outside of human material experience, there was some kind of world beyond this shadow world, as it were, where we might find virtue and justice and courage as a form of those things, perfect and immutable, which we poor creatures in this shadowy world can see only through a glass darkly and struggle to understand and put into effect as best we might. We might say that the origins of universal freedoms and universal rights are found again in the Christian church, and they come from concepts such as being made in the image of God and being equal before the eyes of God. You can certainly see that things like equality before the law are not very far away from the day of judgment in which all souls will be judged equally, be they kings, princes or beggars. That idea must have been around an awful long time. Or they might be that natural rights are found in nature. They are somehow comprised in nature the way that physical properties are, like the laws of physics, Newtonian physics. And it's no accident, of course, that the search for universal rules and laws are particularly prevalent in the period of the Enlightenment, where people like Isaac Newton are discerning certain rules to do with velocity and acceleration and physical laws, Newton's first laws and second laws and so on, that you might equally search for something in nature that is a binding kind of law for man. Well, you can see all of those, to some degree, are going to be problematic. They either seem rather mystical or rather theoretical or contradicted by the simple observation of human beings as they go about the world and see the world as it actually is compared to the world as we think it might ought to be. The universe doesn't seem to be particularly governed by any rules that make it particularly benign. And the more we understand about the universe, it seems a very non-benign sort of place. And as for nature, well, that's obviously red in tooth and claw and so on. So we either have to agree that it's something we've invented, and that is going to lead us into the road of, if it's human invention, then what status does it really have? So if we start with someone like John Locke, the philosopher of the Enlightenment, who observed that he thought the universal rights of man were life and liberty and property. And he might have simply asserted that these were common sense things that all human beings, given if they thought about it at all, might have wanted life rather than not, liberty rather than not, and property rather than not. Well, these are reflected clearly by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, who pens the famous words that all men are created equal, and these are found in nature, they are self-evident. Nature or creator God has indicated that these are self-evident things that we will see if we look carefully enough at the world, and these life, liberty, and in his case, the pursuit of happiness. We'd rather be alive and we'd rather be happy than not. And these are unchanging and immutable laws of nature. In 1789, during the height of the French Revolution, or the beginnings of the French Revolution, as I say, not the height, in the beginnings of the French Revolution in 1789, the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen assert that there are, again, a series of immutable rules and rights that all human beings have. This, then, is a concern for philosophers and political scientists for centuries. Why are some things viewed good? Why are some things viewed beautiful? The search for truth is a philosophical concern. Well, almost immediately, we're going to say, well, it's maybe a philosophical concern, as I said, but does it tally with what the grubby world of human beings? These philosophers may be squeezing the sunlight out of cucumbers and trying to make sense of the world, but in the end, I can see the world around me is not governed by those things. It's governed by human frailty. And the collision between human frailty and universal values, between practical politics, between changing understandings of social attitudes and values, and trying to establish universal, immutable values, is a problem for all bills of rights. To illustrate that, of course, you only have to look at the French Revolution and its narrative, and how that was soon drenched in the blood of people, presumably who failed to understand the universal truth of the brotherhood of man, therefore had to be executed for their failure to understand that. Or, as I used to say to my students, trying to imagine the scene as Thomas Jefferson dipped his quill pen delicately in the inkwell, penning the great resounding phrases, "I hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. I'm jolly good. I'm doing really well this morning. And life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Well, I really am on a roll here." And he looks out of the window of his house of Monticello across a bucolic scene of grass and lawns and trees, and thinks to himself, "Oh, those slaves, lazy buggers. Note to future self, go and give the slaves a good kicking later." Reality, human reality, and universal values aren't going to sit neatly together. And Jeremy Bentham, another philosopher of the Enlightenment and utilitarian, rooted in an idea of what works and pragmatism and so on, in an essay called The Anarchical Fallacies, objected to in response to the French Revolution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Citizen, said two objections which resonate with us today. First, he said, it's arrogant. The French have discovered human, not French, but human universal values and rights. Well, that's very good of them to do it for all of us and all of the world. And indeed, ever since the first declarations of universal human rights were found either in the UN or in Europe or in Western countries or in the ideas of Immanuel Kant, they can be seen as, well, Western. They may not equate with other traditions and other cultures. It can seem like an imperialist, rather culturally imperialist, at the very least, enterprise. And certainly arrogant of any particular group and particular place in time. And that was his second objection, Jeremy Bentham, when he observed that the French were writing this then and there, and how would it stand, as he saw, anyone could see, that we will change our views about things and values and so on, will alter through time.